They were never meant to meet. He fell from the sky, bloodied, hunted human. She rose from the jungle, scarred, exiled, something not quite beast and not quite broken. The world that birthed her had long since rejected her. The stars that sent him down had already written him off as lost. But fate doesn't read orders. It doesn't follow the chain of command. It waits in the dark, breathes in the silence between gunfire and heartbeat. And when no one's watching, it places two shattered souls in the same storm. This isn't a story of war. It's what comes after, when survival stops being enough, when a touch becomes dangerous, when love dares to grow in soil soaked with blood. She wasn't looking to be saved, and he didn't come to be a hero, but deep in the wilderness where the laws of galaxy and tribe no longer hold. A legend was born, one heartbeat, one fire, and one child that would defy everything. The sky cracked like ancient bones being torn apart. Lightning spilled through the jungle canopy, turning every vine and twisted branch into a sculpture of momentary fire. Moon planet Zephyro was weeping tonight, not with sorrow but rage. The kind that had no name, the kind that only giants understood. Kalith moved through the rain like a fallen god, shoulders hunched beneath the weight of her own existence. Every step she took left the earth moaning beneath her heels. Mud curled around her feet, clinging, desperate to hold onto something so primal, so wronged. She stood 9 feet tall, covered in gray-violet skin that shimmered like obsidian under rainfall. Scars coiled across her torso, not trophies of war, but punishments for survival. Her golden eyes didn't blink. They glowed, burning not with anger, but something colder, something deeper. The silent resignation of being cast out not for weakness, but for being too much. They said I was too large to be loved, too wide to carry life. But I was not made to be small, she muttered to no one, her voice low as thunder, lost in the sound of leaves screaming in the storm. He pushed through the thorns, shoulders parting the overgrowth like a beast that nature had forgotten how to resist. The jungle snarled back, droplets tracing her collarbone, her arms, her hips. Rain couldn't cleanse what exile had soaked into her bones. She didn't flinch, she hadn't flinched in years, then she smelled it. Smoke. Iron, flesh, something fragile was bleeding near the stream, something warm. She crept forward, nostrils flaring. Through the mist just beyond the broken stones that lined the water's edge lay a figure, crumpled, trembling, barely breathing. A man, human. He was soaked, his skin pallid, his chest rising in shallow jerks. Blood had painted one side of his face like war paint, though she doubted he knew he wore it. His boots were torn, ribs bruised, and one arm was twisted in a way that suggested more pain than sleep. Yet somehow, amidst the storm, he hadn't died. Not yet. Kalith loomed above him. Her breath steamed in the cold air, curling like smoke over his body. She could crush his neck with one toe, could end his heartbeat with a flick of her wrist. She didn't, instead her eyes narrowed, not in mercy but in curiosity. This man, this soft, small, insignificant thing was whispering, "Don't leave me." The words struck her not in the ears but the chest. They thudded against her ribs like fists too small to bruise but too honest to ignore. Something old stirred, something dangerous. She growled, a sound that once sent entire battalions fleeing, but he didn't move, didn't even open his eyes. He only trembled, breath caught between life and whatever followed after. She could leave. And for a second she almost did, but then she looked at him again, really looked. His body was broken, yes, but his spirit, it hadn't shattered yet. And in that defiance she saw herself. Not the Kalith of exile, but the Kalith who once dared to dream she could be more than muscle and menace. A protector, a mother, something sacred. With a hiss of frustration that sounded far too much like grief, she crouched. Her enormous hands reached into the wet soil and pulled loose the animal hide from her pack, stitched from the beast she had slain with her bare hands the day her tribe cast her out. The memory bit into her gut, but she swallowed it whole. She wrapped it around the man's shoulders, tucking it tight. He murmured something she couldn't decipher, maybe a name, maybe a prayer. And then instead of vanishing into the storm like she always had, Kalith stayed. She sat beside him, her massive form towering even while seated. The tree canopies trembled with thunder. The rain soaked through her scars. But Kalith didn't flinch. She watched him breathe. Each rise and fall of his chest was a rebellion, each shiver a declaration, and though she didn't yet know his name, though her people would call this treason, Kalith knew something had shifted in her tonight, something irreversible. This human, this bleeding flame beneath the branches, had not feared her, and for that alone he was already more than most. She pulled her knees to her chest, letting her long arms rest across them. Her eyes remained open, staring through the darkness. Somewhere behind her the jungle pulsed, watching, waiting. Kalith didn't care. She was no longer waiting to be accepted. Now, she was waiting for him to wake. Because deep in her marrow, beneath the silence, a single question burned hotter than the storm. What if this man wasn't the one who needed saving? What if she was? The fire was dying slow, cradled in a bed of broken twigs and bark that smoked more than it burned. Thin threads of emberlight flickered across the hollow of the tree, painting shadows across the uneven walls like the bones of some ancient creature that had long since vanished. The wind outside howled low, dragging the breath of the jungle into the hollow like a ghost uncertain of its place. Tomas stirred. Pain greeted him first, then cold. Then, the weight of a presence so massive it stopped his breath. His eyes fluttered open, blinking through the haze of smoke and confusion. What he saw wasn't a dream. It wasn't a nightmare either. It was her. Calith, a figure carved from the kind of myth people bury in fire and salt. He sat just beyond the fire, knees drawn up, chin resting on the edge of her arm. Her eyes, those strange golden eyes, glowed faintly in the dark, not from reflection but from something deeper. Something alive inside her that hadn't yet decided if he deserved to be spared. Tomas couldn't move. He didn't dare, she didn't speak, didn't lunge, didn't snarl, just watched. He tried to sit, but every muscle screamed. His ribs were bruised, his shoulder dislocated maybe. Still, he found the strength to ask, voice cracked and dry, "Are you real?" The answer came not in words, but in a sound. Somewhere between a snort and a rumble, like the jungle itself had sighed through her lungs. She turned her head slightly, the corner of her mouth lifting but not into a smile. It was something else, something older. The silence stretched, tense but not hostile. He sat up slowly, one hand clutching his side. Rain still tapped the outside bark in uneven rhythms. The fire cracked weakly between them. He reached out, fumbling through the kindling, and pulled a few damp sticks from the pile beside him. She tilted her head. He stacked them carefully like she was watching a ritual she didn't yet trust. He gestured to the fire, then the wood, tapping twice and blowing gently. Her gaze didn't waver. With a shiver, the flames caught. Dim, weak, but holding. Then something changed. Her massive form shifted forward, elbows resting on her knees, eyes locked on his hands like she was trying to read something inside them. He could feel it. The weight of her attention was like gravity. He looked up, hesitant. You don't talk, do you?" She raised a single clawed finger to her lips, a gesture he understood. Quiet. Then she turned her head toward the hollow's entrance. The sound of something moving beyond the trees, something with teeth rustled through the air. Tomas tensed. She didn't. Calith inhaled deep and slow, then released a sound so low it hummed through the floor, a warning, not a scream. It rumbled like a buried volcano. Whatever was out there fled. She turned back to him, calm, unshaken. Tomas stared, mouth slightly parted. "How did you do that?" She tapped her throat, then pointed to his, then the fire, then her chest. Sequence, a code, he blinked, catching the meaning slowly. Voice, fire, heart, he mimicked her, voice, fire, heart. A silence passed between them, not emptiness but agreement. In that flickering dim, he realized something unsettling. This wasn't her shelter, it was her cave, yes. But she had never needed fire before, never needed company. The walls echoed differently with him here. He laid back down slowly, exhaustion overtaking fear. His body folded against the mossy bark, close enough to feel the faint warmth radiating from her side. She didn't move when his shoulder brushed her thigh. He whispered without thinking, "Thank you." Still, she said nothing, but her gaze just for a second softened. Not much, not enough to be sure, but enough to make him believe she wasn't made of stone. As Tomas drifted into unconsciousness, her golden eyes remained open, wide, watchful. She did not sleep. She had slept through wars, through betrayal, through exile, but not this, not him. Something in the air had changed. Not the wind, not the rain, him. He hadn't screamed when he saw her. He hadn't begged. He'd lit a fire and sat beneath her shadow as if he'd always belonged there. That was dangerous. She tilted her head, listening to his breathing slow. And just before dawn, when the stars above Zephyra blinked one last time before vanishing into the mist, Calith allowed herself a single whisper, spoken in a language older than bones. "Maybe, just maybe, you're the storm I was waiting for," and the fire kept burning. The jungle hadn't woken yet. It merely breathed. Mist hung low, curling around tree roots like it was afraid of rising. Dew glistened on every surface, on stone, on bark, on skin. Somewhere above, the twin moons of Zephyra were retreating behind Cloudville, and the sky blushed a soft violet no language on earth had a name for. Calith sat near the stream, one arm draped across her bent knee, her breathing steady but her mind nowhere near calm. The scars across her body ached not from damage but from memory. Some wounds forget. Hers remembered everything, and then she felt him approach. Tomas's steps were careful now, not fearful, just respectful. He no longer walked like prey. He walked like someone who knew she could kill him in a heartbeat and chose to come closer anyway. He knelt beside her, clutching a handful of crushed herbs and the remains of boiled moss paste. His hair was still damp from the night's storm. His eyes tired but steady, no trembling, no hesitation. She didn't look at him, but she didn't move away either. "Who did this to you?" he asked quietly. His fingers traced the edge of the scar on her left side, just under her ribs. It ran nearly 2 feet long, puckered and brutal. She didn't answer. Her jaw tightened. Her muscles flexed out of instinct. But she didn't stop him. He moved with purpose, hands slow, never grabbing, only gliding. The pads of his thumbs were rough from labor, but there was something almost ceremonial in how he worked. His touch wasn't invasive. It asked for permission without words. And when he pressed the paste to her skin, it wasn't pain she felt, it was absence, the absence of fear. She had forgotten what it was like to be touched without flinching. "You've had these for years, haven't you?" he murmured. Calith glanced down at him. His eyes were focused, tracing every line of her skin like it held stories he wanted to learn, not fear. For a moment she wanted to turn away, to bark at him, to remind him she wasn't his pet project. But the words never came. His fingers paused at a scar that ran diagonally across her shoulder, thinner than the rest. "This one," he whispered, "looks like it was from a blade, clean, measured, someone meant it." She said nothing. Then, as if he couldn't hold it back any longer, he looked up into her eyes and said it. "You're not a monster." Silence, then softer, "You're beautiful." The words landed like heat in her throat. She felt them burn down to the part of her she'd buried beneath all that muscle and armor. She exhaled sharply, not from rage, but from the unfamiliar weight of it. Her jaw tightened. She let out a low, guttural sound, more growl than sigh. "Don't lie to me, little man." Her voice wasn't angry, just tired. He didn't flinch. "I'm not." She stared at him, longer this time, longer than she ever let anyone. His face was worn, cut beneath the eye. Sun-kissed where his helmet hadn't covered. A human, a soldier, a mechanic, whatever he was, he saw her, not the silhouette, not the rumors, her. Caliph blinked once, slowly. Then, without speaking, she shifted her massive frame. Her leg extended to the side, her arm drawing him in gently, like one would with a wounded animal that had learned too well how to bite. He didn't resist. She let him rest his head on her thigh, her fingers unconsciously brushing the strands of dark hair from his face. His breathing slowed, steadying with each beat of her pulse. For the first time in years, she felt something other than fight or flight churn in her chest. She felt warmth. He closed his eyes. She stayed still, not because she was afraid to move, but because something inside her was moving too fast to control. She looked down at him, this fragile storm of blood and spirit who had crawled into her exile and lit a fire. Her fingers hovered above his brow, not quite touching. It was not hers, not yet, but the idea of letting him go burned worse than any scar across her skin. The jungle around them whispered, leaves shifted not from wind but from something unseen. The trees leaned closer, as if bearing witness to a moment not meant for gods or ghosts, but something far more dangerous. Hope. Caliph closed her eyes, the scent of moss, wood smoke, and human skin seeping into her senses like a drug. Beneath the silence, her body betrayed her. The heart she had trained to stay still had begun to beat, not like a warrior, but like a woman. The storm had no rhythm that night. It howled and whimpered, clawed at the jungle like a wounded beast. Rain hammered the canopy and hissed against the bark of the hollow tree, as if the planet itself disapproved of what was happening within its lungs. Inside the shelter, their breath was louder than the thunder. Caliph sat hunched against the curve of the tree's interior wall, her knees drawn high, arms coiled tight across her chest like armor she didn't know how to remove. Her skin, slick with rain and sweat, steamed faintly in the fire's low light. Tomas was across from her, his silhouette framed by the dying embers, shoulders shivering but not from cold. He had chosen to stay close tonight, closer than before, closer than she thought he dared, and she hadn't stopped him. Outside, the wind screeched like some primitive warning, but inside, there was only silence, thick and vibrating like the air between two creatures on the brink of something sacred or catastrophic. Tomas shifted, his voice soft and threadbare. "You're warm." His hand, small and scarred, rose to her cheek. It was the first time he'd touched her face. She didn't know how to receive it. Her first instinct was to recoil, to bare her teeth and remind him what she was, but she didn't. Instead, her head tilted into his palm, just slightly. She wanted to pretend it was to assess him, to read his pulse, to measure his intentions, but the truth was simpler. She wanted the contact. Caliph's voice came low and harsh, like stone cracking beneath pressure. "If I lose control," she murmured, "I could crush you without meaning to." He didn't flinch. "Then teach me how to touch you without fear." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was charged. A fuse in the dark. She turned her head slowly, gold eyes locking with his. She could see the outline of his thoughts, jumbled, half afraid, half determined. He was terrified, but more than that, he was honest. She moved first, not with hunger, not with dominance, but with something far more dangerous, hesitation. She leaned down, slowly letting her forehead hover against his. He didn't move. Their breaths tangled. The scent of him, smoke, sap, and salt, coiled through her like a vine gripping tight around something buried in her chest. Then gently she pressed her lips to his. It was awkward at first. The angle strange. The difference in scale like trying to fit a mountain into a valley, but he didn't retreat. He reached for her, sliding his hand to the nape of her neck, pulling her closer in the only way he knew how, like a man who had nothing left to lose but wanted, desperately, to stay. When she kissed him again, there was no hesitation. There was hunger, but it wasn't the kind that devoured. It was the kind that starved. Caliph pulled back slightly, her breath shaking in her throat. She studied his expression, waiting for fear, waiting for disgust. Waiting for him to finally see her as the beast she'd always believed she was, but all he did was smile, slow, uneven, real. "You're not what they said you were," he whispered. "You're more." She stared at him, not blinking, not breathing. And in that moment something broke, not violently, not like glass shattering, but like ice melting after 1,000 winters. He moved closer, curling into her side, his body small against hers. She hesitated once, then wrapped her arm around him, drawing him into her lap like a shield she'd never learned how to use. His head rested against her chest. And she, Caliph the outcast, the wound-bearer, the giantess they said could never be touched, held a man not to protect him from the world, but to remind herself that the world had been wrong. Her body, once hated, once deemed a prison, now cradled something living, something choosing her. Not despite what she was, but because of it. And outside, the storm raged on, beating against the world with the fury of those who could never understand what it meant to finally feel home inside another's heartbeat. The clearing came alive in golden silence, like the world had decided, for a brief, impossible moment, to breathe with them instead of against them. Zephyr's second sun broke across the sky with a whisper, not a roar, casting molten light across the treetops, catching the dew like diamonds strung along vines. Somewhere nearby, a bird with skin like smoke trilled a note so sharp it felt holy. The jungle hadn't forgotten what they were, it simply allowed them to exist. Their shelter had become a home. Ropes of sun-dried bark ran across a half-built wall where Tomas had tried, and mostly failed, to teach the alien trees how to behave like timber. The fire pit was lopsided but fed well, and 2 spears leaned against the roots like lazy sentries. The space smelled like charred meat, cracked stone, and the oils Caliph used on her skin when she thought he wasn't watching. It had been weeks since the first night, since the rain, since the kiss. Now they hunted together, shared silence. In language, strange words passed between them, half-spoken, half-sketched in dirt, carved in bark, learned from lips and laughter. And today, for the first time since exile, Caliph laughed. Not a growl, not a snort. A full-bodied, sky-shaking sound that startled the birds into flight. Tomas nearly dropped the berry root he'd been slicing. Was that a laugh or an earthquake? Caliph bared her teeth, mock-threatening, but her eyes gleamed, golden and amused. Maybe both, she said in his language, her voice thick with accent and uncertainty, but somehow. Warm, he grinned like a man who had forgotten the universe outside this grove existed. You ever think of visiting Earth? He asked. Her head tilted. Is it a forest? Parts of it, he said, then gestured wide with both arms, exaggerating. But not like this. We've got oceans, deserts, buildings so tall they touch the sky. Caliph watched him closely. Do your skies breathe fire? He laughed, only when we're doing something stupid. They sat for a while like that, beside the fire, beside each other. The space between them had shrunk with time. Once a chasm of biology and instinct, now reduced to a breath, a glance, a brush of a shoulder. But that morning something shifted. Tomas was the first to notice it. He had moved behind her, wrapping a thin hide over her shoulders when he paused. His hand hovered, then pressed gently against her lower back. She turned, slow and wary. What? He hesitated. Your body, your shape, it's different. She froze. He stepped around her, eyes searching, cautious. Not afraid, never afraid. His hands found her sides, traced the swell just beneath her stomach where the ridged musculature that once held nothing now seemed. Taut full, Caliph, he whispered, are you? She didn't speak, just stared at him. Then, without breaking his gaze, she reached for his wrist. Her fingers curled around it like iron wrapped in velvet, and she guided his hand gently to her abdomen. At first there was only warmth, and then there, a pulse, not hers, not his, something new. Tomas's breath hitched. There is life inside me, she said, voice barely audible, as if the words themselves could break the spell. And I don't know what it means. He said nothing, didn't try to explain it, didn't pretend he understood more than the moment allowed, but tears welled in his eyes before he could stop them. Caliph looked at him, not as the giant, not as the exile, not even as the protector, but as something softer, something sacred. He dropped to his knees before her, hands still resting against her belly, his head bowed. She reached down slowly, almost clumsily, and brushed a single clawed finger beneath his eye. The tear came away clear, fragile, human. Her hand lingered on his face, thumb resting against his cheek. Why do you cry? He looked up and his voice cracked open. Because I never thought the universe would give me something this real. Her heart ached in places she didn't know could feel. The kind of ache that came from being seen, not just looked at. No, not just touched. She sank to her knees with him, folding her massive form around his, letting his arms hold what little of her they could. He wrapped around her like armor made of breath and promise. Outside, the jungle stirred again. The sky shifted. The birds held their songs. And in the stillness of the clearing, where war had not yet found them and old laws did not apply, a new law was born, one written not in blood or tradition, but in warmth, in sound, in the slow, rhythmic thrum of life beneath Caliph's skin. She was not supposed to be able to carry life, but the stars had never asked permission, and love had never obeyed rules. The wind stopped. That was the first warning. Not the sound of beasts nor the rustling hush of leaves, just the sudden, unnatural stillness, as if the jungle itself had sucked in a breath and refused to let it go. Caliph stood slowly, eyes narrowing, her body coiled not in fear, but in the kind of readiness born of old blood and ancient betrayals. She didn't blink, she didn't breathe, and then she felt it. Rhythm beneath the soil, subtle as a heartbeat, rising in waves through her soles. Not animal, not storm, a march. She turned toward the trees. Tomas noticed it too. The way her shoulders locked, the slow flare of her nostrils, how her pupils narrowed into slits. He followed her gaze into the wall of green, his own breath catching on something invisible. What is it? He whispered, barely audible. Her voice was a grave wrapped in velvet. They've found me. The canopy split open like a wound. They emerged not like men, but like revenants. Towering forms wrapped in bone-forged armor, their faces hidden behind horned masks carved from beasts Tomas couldn't name. They moved without sound, their feet barely disturbing the moss. And at their head Vok, 7 feet tall, broad as 2 warriors. Kaleth's brother by blood, commander by force, executioner by choice. He wore her father's skull on his shoulder. His eyes locked on her belly, then dropped to Tomas, whose fingers curled around a crude blade made from flint and vine. It shook in his grip, but he didn't let go. Vok sneered. "Kaleth," he rumbled, voice like a landslide. "What in the void have you become?" She said nothing. He turned his gaze on Tomas, eyes gleaming with contempt. "This thing, this fragile skin sack," his voice twisted with mockery. "You let it plant life inside you." Kaleth didn't move. Another warrior stepped forward, armored in carapace and ash, a female. "You've shamed our bloodline, mated with a creature of no caste, no form, no power." And then from the ranks behind them, a laugh. Dry, sharp, cruel, more joined like the breaking of sticks beneath a crushing foot. Laughter born not from humor but disgust. Tomas stepped in front of Kaleth. He knew he should have stayed silent, that his blade was a joke, that if they chose violence he'd be a memory before he hit the ground. But something in her stillness, in the way she didn't deny him, had lit a fire behind his ribs. "You'll have to kill me," he said, jaw tight, voice steady, "if you want to take her." Silence fell. The warriors stared at him, then at each other. And then hysterical, roaring laughter erupted through the trees. This small, dirt-covered human, blade no sharper than a twig, standing before the most dangerous bloodline in their quadrant. It was absurd, a jest for the gods, but Kaleth didn't laugh. Her eyes never left her brother. She stepped forward past Tomas, past the fear, the judgment, the fire of her tribe's scorn. "He is not my weakness," she said, her voice a thunderclap that cracked the very silence apart. "He is my choice." The air shifted. Vok's grin faded. "You think your defiance matters," he spat. "I think your fear does," she replied. He flinched, not outwardly, not enough for the others to see, but she saw, in his blink, in the way his hand tensed over the hilt at his side. He had come to drag her back, to erase her, cleanse the stain, but he hadn't expected her to choose the stain, to name it sacred. Tomas reached for her hand. She didn't flinch. Their fingers met like two worlds colliding, not breaking. She turned back to her kin, no longer hiding the swell beneath her ribs. "This child is not born of weakness," she said. "It is born of peace, of defiance, of love." The words stung the air. Love, alien, forbidden, inconvenient. Vok took a step forward, and stopped. Behind him, the youngest of the warriors, a boy barely out of rights, lowered his weapon. A seed had been planted, and in that pause, in that breathless stretch of silence before the jungle dared speak again, the tribe did not attack. They watched, and Kaleth, with Tomas beside her, did not retreat. She had changed. Not just her body, not just her fate, but the soil of who she had been, and that terrified them more than any blade ever could. The wind stopped. That was the first warning. Not the sound of beasts nor the rustling hush of leaves, just the sudden, unnatural stillness, as if the jungle itself had sucked in a breath and refused to let it go. Kaleth stood slowly, eyes narrowing, her body coiled not in fear, but in the kind of readiness born of old blood and ancient betrayals. She didn't blink, she didn't breathe, and then she felt it. Rhythm beneath the soil, subtle as a heartbeat, rising in waves through her soles. Not animal, not storm, a march. She turned toward the trees. Tomas noticed it too. The way her shoulders locked, the slow flare of her nostrils, how her pupils narrowed into slits. He followed her gaze into the wall of green, his own breath catching on something invisible. "What is it?" he whispered, barely audible. Her voice was a grave wrapped in velvet. "They've found me." The canopy split open like a wound. They emerged not like men, but like revenants. Towering forms wrapped in bone-forged armor, their faces hidden behind horned masks carved from beasts Tomas couldn't name. They moved without sound, their feet barely disturbing the moss. And at their head Vok, 7 feet tall, broad as 2 warriors. Kaleth's brother by blood, commander by force, executioner by choice. He wore her father's skull on his shoulder. His eyes locked on her belly, then dropped to Tomas, whose fingers curled around a crude blade made from flint and vine. It shook in his grip, but he didn't let go. Vok sneered. "Kaleth," he rumbled, voice like a landslide. "What in the void have you become?" She said nothing. He turned his gaze on Tomas, eyes gleaming with contempt. "This thing, this fragile skin sack," his voice twisted with mockery. "You let it plant life inside you." Kaleth didn't move. Another warrior stepped forward, armored in carapace and ash, a female. "You've shamed our bloodline, mated with a creature of no caste, no form, no power." And then from the ranks behind them, a laugh. Dry, sharp, cruel, more joined like the breaking of sticks beneath a crushing foot. Laughter born not from humor but disgust. Tomas stepped in front of Kaleth. He knew he should have stayed silent, that his blade was a joke, that if they chose violence he'd be a memory before he hit the ground. But something in her stillness, in the way she didn't deny him, had lit a fire behind his ribs. "You'll have to kill me," he said, jaw tight, voice steady, "if you want to take her." Silence fell. The warriors stared at him, then at each other. And then hysterical, roaring laughter erupted through the trees. This small, dirt-covered human, blade no sharper than a twig, standing before the most dangerous bloodline in their quadrant. It was absurd, a jest for the gods, but Calith didn't laugh. Her eyes never left her brother. She stepped forward past Tomas, past the fear, the judgment, the fire of her tribe's scorn. "He is not my weakness," she said, her voice a thunderclap that cracked the very silence apart. "He is my choice." The air shifted. Vok's grin faded. "You think your defiance matters," he spat. "I think your fear does," she replied. He flinched, not outwardly, not enough for the others to see, but she saw, in his blink, in the way his hand tensed over the hilt at his side. He had come to drag her back, to erase her, cleanse the stain, but he hadn't expected her to choose the stain, to name it sacred. Tomas reached for her hand. She didn't flinch. Their fingers met like two worlds colliding, not breaking. She turned back to her kin, no longer hiding the swell beneath her ribs. "This child is not born of weakness," she said. "It is born of peace, of defiance, of love." The words stung the air. Love, alien, forbidden, inconvenient. Vok took a step forward, and stopped. Behind him, the youngest of the warriors, a boy barely out of rights, lowered his weapon. A seed had been planted, and in that pause, in that breathless stretch of silence before the jungle dared speak again, the tribe did not attack. They watched, and Calith, with Tomas beside her, did not retreat. She had changed. Not just her body, not just her fate, but the soil of who she had been, and that terrified them more than any blade ever could. The rain had stopped days ago, but the earth still held the scent of thunder, rich, alive, trembling beneath the surface. Inside the crude stone shelter nestled against a moss-covered cliff, there was no sound but breathing, deep, labored, sacred. Calith lay against woven furs, her skin slick with sweat, her jaw clenched in silence so fierce it made the rocks outside seem fragile. Her body trembled, but not from fear. This was the war her ancestors never trained her for. No weapon could help her now. No armor could shield her from what tore through her, pain that was wholly primal and hers alone. Tomas knelt at her side. His hands, calloused from fire-making, from shaping wood, from killing to feed them, now trembled for a new reason. Not from the jungle, not from battle, but from the sheer gravity of what came next. She grunted, breath hissing through her fangs, and then came the sound that rewrote the world, a cry, sharp, new, alive. He caught the child in his arms, still slick, still screaming, eyes clenched as if furious to leave the safety of the womb. But it was alive, ferociously so. Calith tilted her head up, strength draining from her limbs, and her gaze locked on them. On him, on her, Tomas, still crouched, looked down in awe at the little creature in his arms. Small fists curled with impossible strength. A faint glow pulsed beneath her skin, not human, not alien, but something else, something new. "She has your fire," Calith whispered, her voice raw like the wind over shattered glass. Her lips barely moved, but her eyes were molten, soft, vulnerable in a way that didn't exist before. He smiled. Not the smile of a man who had won, but of one who understood. Understood what it cost her to bring this life into the world. Understood what they had risked just to exist. "And your eyes," he said, choking on the words like they were too big for his throat. Tears streaked through the dirt on his cheeks, falling onto the child's skin. She didn't flinch. Calith reached out. Her claws were dulled now, blunted by effort and blood loss. But they still held power. With one trembling finger, she traced the child's face, just once, then let her hand fall, and together, without speaking, they cried. Outside, the jungle exhaled. Creatures watched from trees. The wind shifted like it carried a secret too ancient for words. They had said Calith's womb was barren, a cursed vessel, a dead end. They were wrong. Because within this shelter of stone and bone, under the watch of stars older than memory, something impossible had taken its first breath. And it would change everything. Beneath the violet canopy of twilight, the rebuilt clearing breathed in rhythm with the jungle. Ferns curled lazily under the weight of dew, and fireflies blinked like old stars returning to watch something sacred unfold. The once-scarred earth now cradled a life reborn, not just in soil and shelter, but in bloodlines and bonds that defied what was written. Their child had no name in the old tongue. There simply weren't words for something that had never been imagined. She ran on 4 limbs before walking on 2, leaped before she understood the ground, and roared before she could speak. Her voice, deep and fierce like her mother's, scattered birds from the trees. But then, just as suddenly, she would burst into laughter that echoed across the clearing. Warm, human, her father's joy wrapped in wildness. Calith watched with a quiet ferocity, every muscle coiled like she was still in battle. Yet her eyes softened whenever her daughter's claws scraped bark, or when she pounced too early in a hunt and missed. The lessons were passed down not in words but in instincts, how to listen to the ground before it trembles, how to breathe with your prey, how to honor what you kill. Tomas taught fire, not just the striking of flint or the stacking of drywood, but the ritual of it. How to whisper thanks to the spark before it became flame. How to warm food, not scorch it. How to shield it from wind with the curve of your own body, like a father protecting a sleeping child. And sometimes, when the girl was still enough to listen, he taught her about stars. The ones humans named long ago, and the ones he saw fall the night he crashed into her mother's world. But the jungle was not silent. It never truly was. Whispers drifted from tribe to tribe, of a warrior queen who had rejected the path of her ancestors, of a human who hadn't conquered her but stood beside her, of a child born from rebellion and mercy. One by one the exiled came, Not marching, not pleading, just arriving. A limping elder with a broken tusk. A mother who had lost her clutch and could no longer bear children. A quiet hunter who had once dared to love beyond his caste. They didn't speak much at first, just watched from the shadows, hovered beyond the clearing, but they stayed. Kalith saw them, not as threats, not anymore. She saw them for what they were, the broken pieces of an old world, quietly gathering around something that might become a new one. That night, as the fire danced low and the child curled between them, Tomas leaned close. His hand brushed Kalith's rough skin against clawed grace. "You were never too much," he whispered, voice barely more than breath. The world was just too small. She didn't answer, didn't need to. The way her fingers closed around his said enough. The world wasn't too small anymore. They were building a larger one, with teeth and warmth, with fire and forgiveness. Not a pack born of blood, but of choice. And in that quiet, roaring space between the stars and the soil, they chose each other. Again and again and again. The first rays of light spilled over the jagged tree line like whispers from another world, gold threading through the dark canopy. The jungle had never known silence, only the breathing of leaves, the distant calls of beasts that remembered ancient blood, and now, soft, rhythmic, came the breath of something even older than instinct. Peace. Tomas lay against Kalith's chest, the weight of her arms coiled gently around him, protective, sure. Not the way warriors hold prisoners, but how a storm holds the eye. Their child, small but wild, curled between them, her tiny claws tangled in her father's shirt. She murmured something in her sleep, half growl, half sigh, and Tomas smiled through the ache in his ribs. He had survived wars, crashes, and betrayals, but he'd never imagined surviving love, until her. Kalith looked down at him, her eyes no longer burning but deep, endless, like a jungle pool that showed not just reflection but revelation. Her fingers brushed his beard, still tangled from last night's rain. There was something in her breath, not just words, something sacred, like old songs sung before fire existed. "You didn't just survive me," she whispered, voice hoarse, reverent. "You made me real." Tomas blinked slowly, his lips pulling into a crooked, stubborn grin. "I told you," he said, his voice rough from sleep and old scars. "Let them come, we're already a legend." The jungle responded, not with threat, but with acknowledgement. The canopy rustled like something ancient bowing. Monkeys howled in the distance, not in warning, but in chorus. The world did not resist their existence anymore. It watched them, maybe even protected them. And then they moved. Kalith rose first, powerful yet slow, careful not to wake their child. She shifted the girl onto her back, secured by strips of woven bark and cloth. Tomas stood beside her, one hand on his side, the other reaching instinctively for hers. Their fingers intertwined, not perfectly, not easily, but willingly. And then, side by side, they walked, not away from the forest, not toward civilization, but into the deep green belly of the unknown, where shadows curled like smoke and vines whispered of gods long forgot. 3 silhouettes stretched across the clearing, one tall and alien, one human and scarred, one small and untamed. A new constellation. They didn't need thrones or flags. They didn't leave behind monuments carved in stone. They left something more dangerous, more permanent, a story. One the stars themselves might whisper across planets, of a woman made of claw and fury, of a man with nothing left to lose, of a child born of both war and mercy, and of a love so fierce not even exile could wither it. In a universe obsessed with control, they had chosen the only rebellion that ever mattered: family. So in the heart of a world that once sought to break them, they built something unthinkable. Not a fortress, not an empire, but a bond, raw, defiant, sacred. She was forged in exile, taught to destroy. He was stranded, meant to vanish without a name. But together, they carved a new legend into the bones of the jungle and bled truth where others preached fear. They said she was too monstrous to love. They said he was too fragile to survive. And they were wrong twice. Because in the silence after war, where scars still whispered, their child roared. A daughter born of fire and flesh, of claws and compassion. Proof that 2 worlds long at war could birth something neither had the courage to imagine. Not just survival, but future. This was never just about one human or one alien. This was a question echoing across stars. What happens when love refuses to obey the rules of the galaxy? Now, what if this wasn't the only story? What if beyond the treetops, others are watching, other hearts breaking the mold, other monsters learning how to love? If you heard the call tonight, you're not alone. You've only just entered the archives of the forbidden. And I promise what comes next is far stranger, and far more human. Subscribe to it. Alien Chronicles us, because love like this, it doesn't end, it evolves.